Clara Ashford pressed the crumpled letter against her chest so hard, the paper bit into her palm, standing in the dust of Sagebrush Hollow, with nothing but a single trunk and a name she'd agreed to carry for the rest of her life. The man in front of her wasn't what she'd imagined. He wasn't even close. Tall and silent as a fence post, weathered jaw set like carved stone eyes that looked straight through her, and on either side of him, two small children staring up at her like she was something they'd never seen before and weren't sure they wanted to. If you've ever left everything behind searching for something real, stay with me. Subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The stagecoach had smelled of leather and sweat and old tobacco, and Clara Ashford had spent the last 3 days convincing herself that was perfectly fine. That everything was going to be perfectly fine. She had the letter memorized by now. She'd read it so many times the ink had faded at the creases. A man of good standing, a working ranch, a quiet life with purpose. Those were the words the agency had used. She'd carried those words like a lantern through every mile of desert and dust, telling herself that whatever waited at the end of this road had to be better than what she'd left behind. She was wrong. Not immediately. Not in the first second. All she could register was the heat. The raw, breathless, merciless heat of the Texas summer pressing down on Sagebrush Hollow like a hand flattening paper. Clara stepped off the coach, and her boot heel sank into the soft earth of the road, and she looked up, and there he was. Silas Drifter. He was taller than she expected, broader through the shoulders. His hat was dark brown and dusty, his jaw lined with the kind of stubble that suggested shaving was something he got to when he got to it. And his eyes. She noticed his eyes first before anything else were a pale, careful gray that looked like winter sky. Not unkind, but not warm. Not anything close to warm. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't even trying to smile. He pulled his hat off his head, held it at his side, gave her a single nod. "Miss Ashford?" "Mr. Drifter." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She was proud of that. A beat of silence opened between them that felt about 3 miles wide. Clara became acutely aware of how she must look. Her traveling dress rumpled and damp. Her hair half escaped from its pins. Her white gloves already gray at the fingertips from the coach's windowsill. She had dressed carefully that morning. She had tried. She could see from the flat line of his mouth that he had noticed neither the effort nor its failure. "You're smaller than I pictured," he said. "Not unkind, just a fact." "You're quieter than I expected," she said back. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but the corner of his mouth moved. 1 fraction of an inch. He put his hat back on. "Fair enough," he said. It was only then that she noticed them. The boy was maybe 8, dark-haired like his father, with his father's same straight posture and his father's same watchful eyes, except where Silas's eyes held stillness. The boy's held a spark, bright and restless and assessing. He had his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, and he was looking at Clara, the way a person looks at something that has walked into the wrong place. The girl was smaller, 6, maybe 7. She stood just half a step behind her brother with her hands folded in front of her, her dark hair braided back, and she was not looking at Clara at all. She was looking at her shoes. Clara glanced at Silas. Silas did not explain. "These your children?" Clara asked, though she already knew. She could see his jaw in the boy's jaw, his stillness in the girl's careful posture. "My son Jake," Silas said. "My daughter Emma." Jake gave her a long, measuring look. "Pa said you were coming from New York City." "That's right," Clara said. "Why?" "Jake," Silas said. 1 word, that was all. The boy pressed his lips together. Clara almost smiled in spite of herself. "It's all right," she said. She crouched down so she was eye level with him. Up close, Jake had a smear of something dirt or ash or both across his left cheekbone, and a small cut healing at his chin that suggested he'd recently lost an argument with the ground. "I left because I wanted something different." Different from what? Jake asked. From everything I already had. Jake considered this with the seriousness of someone 3 times his age. Didn't you like it there? I liked parts of it, Clara said honestly. But liking something and belonging to it aren't the same thing. Jake had nothing to say to that. He looked at his father. Silas was watching Clara with that same unreadable gray expression. She stood back up, brushed the dust from her skirt, and looked at Emma. Emma still wasn't looking at her. "Hello, Emma," Clara said gently. Emma's fingers tightened against each other. After a long moment, she lifted her eyes brown deep, careful, and met Clara's for exactly 1 second before dropping them again. "Hello," Emma whispered. That was all. But something about the smallness of it, the courage it took for the child to say even that one quiet word, landed somewhere inside Clara's chest and stayed there. Silas picked up her trunk, as though it weighed nothing, and started walking. "Wagons this way," he said. Clara followed. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes, and Silas spent most of them in silence. Jake spent most of them asking questions about New York, about what the buildings looked like, whether she'd ever seen the ocean, whether she'd ever been in a fight. And Clara answered each one as fully and honestly as she could, because she had the sense that honesty was the only currency that would buy her anything with this child. Emma sat beside her brother and said nothing, but Clara caught her watching more than once from the corner of those careful brown eyes. "Do you know how to ride?" Jake asked. "No," Clara admitted. "Do you know how to shoot?" Jake, Silas said from the front. "I'm just asking." "No," Clara said. "I don't know how to shoot either." Jake absorbed this. "Do you know how to do anything useful?" Clara opened her mouth, closed it, thought with unexpected fairness about what the honest answer actually was. She could play piano. She could arrange flowers. She could navigate a dinner party seating chart and conduct a polite conversation in French. She could dress herself in 14 minutes and arrive looking like she'd been groomed for 2 hours. "I can learn," she said finally. Jake looked at her, looked at his father's back, looked back at her. "Pa says that's the most important thing. Being willing to learn. Your father sounds like a smart man." "He is," Jake said without hesitation or irony. "He's the smartest man I know." Clara looked at the back of Silas Drifter's shoulders, the set of them straight and steady, the reins loose and easy in his large roughened hands, and said nothing. The ranch house was not what she had pictured. She had not, if she was being honest with herself, pictured anything luxurious. She'd understood in the abstract that this would be a working ranch, a simple life, nothing like the brownstone she'd grown up in with its gas lamps and Persian rugs and cook who made breakfast at 7 and dinner at 8. She'd understood that. She'd told herself she was prepared. She had not been prepared. The house was a single story, timber-framed with a covered porch that listed slightly to one side, and a front door that had been repaired at least twice by someone who hadn't quite matched the original wood. The yard was clean swept, she would realize later, probably by Emma, but spare. A well. A fence that needed 2 of its rails replaced. A stand of cottonwood trees along the far edge that threw shade across the afternoon. There was nothing beautiful about it, nothing curated or carefully arranged. It was purely entirely functional, and it made no apology for that. Silas carried her trunk up the porch steps and through the front door. Inside, the air was cooler, shadowed. Clara followed and stood in the main room and looked. A long table, 4 chairs, a cook stove, shelves along one wall holding tin plates and cups and a row of jars, a stone fireplace that took up most of the far wall. On the mantel, 2 things, a small Bible with a cracked spine and a framed daguerreotype, a woman dark-haired with Emma's eyes and Jake's stubborn set of chin. Clara looked at the photograph for longer than she meant to. "That's our mama," Jake said from beside her. She hadn't heard him come in. "She's beautiful," Clara said. "She died," Jake said. 2 years ago, fever." "I'm sorry," Clara said. Jake shrugged, but it was the shrug of someone who had practiced looking like it didn't still reach right into his chest every time it came up. "Pa doesn't talk about it," he said. "Emma cries sometimes, but she tries to do it where nobody sees." Clara looked down at him. He was watching the photograph with an expression that was too old for his face. "Do you cry?" she asked quietly. Jake's jaw tightened exactly like his father's. "No," he said. "It's all right if you do," Clara said. "I know," he said. "I just don't." Silas appeared in the doorway that led to the back of the house. "I put your trunk in the room on the left," he said to Clara. It was a pause, barely a pause at all, but she caught it. It was the spare room. Yours now, not his room. The spare room. He'd said it carefully. Clara understood without needing him to explain further, and she didn't ask him to. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, turned. "Supper's in 2 hours. Jake, go check on the horses." "Yes, sir." Jake went. Emma had materialized from somewhere Clara hadn't seen her come in, and was now at the cook stove arranging kindling with the methodical focus of a child who had been doing this particular task long enough to know exactly how she wanted it done. Clara watched her for a moment. Then she moved to the other side of the stove. "Can I help?" Emma stilled. She looked at Clara from beneath her lashes, that same quick assessing look. Then she very carefully moved one piece of kindling to the left and pointed at the empty space it had left. Clara picked up a piece of wood from the pile and placed it where Emma had indicated. Emma studied it, adjusted it slightly, gave a small, satisfied nod. It was the closest thing to welcome Clara had received since stepping off the stagecoach, and it settled somewhere in her chest like warmth. Supper that evening was beans and salt pork and cornbread made by Silas, in the time it took Clara to wash the travel dust from her face and change her dress. The four of them sat at the table, and Jake talked about the horses, about a fence that had gone down in the south field, about a hawk's nest he'd found in the cottonwoods, and Silas responded in short, direct sentences, and Emma ate carefully and said almost nothing, and Clara sat in her chair and felt the particular vertigo of a person who has stepped entirely outside of everything they have ever known. The table settings were mismatched. The cornbread was slightly underdone in the center and slightly overdone at the edges. There was no wine, no cloth napkin, no candlelight. There was just the early evening coming through the window and the sound of a family that had learned to exist without one of its members and had made a kind of peace with the shape of that absence. "Do you cook?" Silas asked her without looking up from his plate. "Some," Clara said, which was generous. She had boiled water. She had assembled cold plates. She had once memorably attempted biscuits and produced something her sister had compared not unkindly to chalk. "I'll teach you what you need to know," Silas said. "I'd appreciate that." He glanced up then briefly. Something in her voice, the absence of pride in it perhaps, or the presence of actual willingness, made him look at her for a half-second longer than he had been. Then he looked back down. "We start early," he said. 4:30 most mornings." 4:30, Clara repeated. "Cows don't sleep late," Jake offered helpfully. "No," Clara said. "I don't suppose they do." After supper, Jake helped clear the table with the practiced ease of a child long accustomed to chores, stacking the tin plates in a way that suggested a specific order had been established and maintained. Emma brought the water in from outside a bucket, almost as large as she was carried with both hands, careful and unhurried. Clara reached for it instinctively. "I can—" she started. Emma shook her head. Just once. She set the bucket where it belonged beside the basin and began to pour. Clara lowered her hands and stepped back. "All right," she thought, "you carry your own water." Noted. Silas came in from checking the horses while Jake was washing up, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the room at Emma pouring water at Clara standing nearby, not quite knowing what to do with herself, and something passed across his face that Clara couldn't name. "Jake," he said, "take your sister and get ready for bed." "It's not even dark yet," Jake said. "Jake." Jake made a sound that was not quite a complaint and not quite a sigh, and was perhaps both at once. "Yes, sir." He looked at Clara. "Good night, Miss Ashford." "Good night, Jake," she said. Emma paused in her work, and for a moment Clara thought she wouldn't say anything. Then, in that same small, careful voice, Good night." "Good night, Emma," Clara said, and meant it more than she'd meant most things she'd said all day. The children disappeared into the back hallway. Clara and Silas stood in the main room, and the silence that settled between them now was different from the silence in the wagon. Less wide, perhaps, but somehow more present. The way a closed door feels more specific than open air. Silas moved to the mantel and stood with his back to her for a moment. Clara sat in one of the chairs at the table and folded her hands and waited. "I should tell you some things," he said. "All right," she said. He turned around. He leaned against the mantel with his arms crossed and looked at her directly. The first time all evening he'd looked at her like he was actually seeing her, rather than assessing whether she would be a problem. "The agency told me you were suitable for ranch life. I don't know what they based that on." "Probably my letter," Clara said. "I may have overstated my experience with outdoor work." "Probably," he said. "The children need consistency. They've had a hard 2 years. I can see that." "Emma doesn't warm up quickly. I don't want you to take it personal." "I won't," Clara said. She let me help with the kindling. Something in his face shifted. "She did." "She showed me where to put it," Clara said. "Very specifically." For the first time, something that might in the right light qualify as a real expression moved through Silas Drifter's eyes. Not quite a smile, but close. "That's Emma," he said. "Her way of saying you're all right." "I'll take it," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want to be straight with you, Miss Ashford." "Please," she said. "I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not an easy man to live with. I know that. I work long days, and I don't have a lot left over at the end of them. I can promise you a roof and food and fair treatment. I can't promise you much else." Clara looked at him. At the set of his jaw, the careful, uncomfortable effort of a man who was used to saying very little, finding the words for something he felt he owed her. She thought about the parlor back home in New York, the silk drapes, the smell of her mother's perfume, the endless rotation of society dinners, where men said beautiful empty things across candlelit tables and meant none of them. "Mr. Drifter," she said, "the man I nearly married in New York promised me the world and couldn't keep a single one of his promises. I'll take a roof and fair treatment, and a man who says what he means over that arrangement every single time." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "Why'd you come here?" he asked. "Really?" It was a fair question. A brave one, actually. She thought braver than most men would have been. She owed him an honest answer. "My father died last winter," she said. "Left debts." "My mother had already remarried, and her new husband made it very clear that my presence in that house was a temporary accommodation. The man I was supposed to marry decided on reflection that a woman without a fortune was a woman without appeal." She paused. "So I wrote to the agency." Silas said nothing. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," she said. "I'm telling you because you asked what was real, and that's real. Your family know you're here. My sister does. She cried and told me I was making a terrible mistake and then helped me pack my trunk." Clara felt the particular ache of that memory, her sister's hands folding her things, face wet, voice steady. "She's the best person I know." "You close?" "Very." Silas nodded slowly. "Must have been hard. Leaving." "It was," Clara said, "but staying would have been harder." He pushed himself off the mantel and moved toward the hallway. At the doorway, he stopped. "I'll be up at 4, he said. "Coffee's on the second shelf. Emma can show you the rest in the morning." "Mr. Drifter," Clara said. He stopped. "Thank you for being honest with me," she said. "I know that took something." He didn't turn around, but his shoulders shifted slightly under his shirt. "Get some rest, Miss Ashford," he said. "Tomorrow starts early." And then he was gone, and Clara was alone in the main room of a house that was nothing like anything she had ever lived in a town she had never seen before, married. Nearly married, legally bound to a man she had spoken perhaps 30 sentences to, with 2 children who were watching her from a careful distance, and an enormous and uncertain future spread out in all directions like flat Texas land. She sat for a while in the chair. She could hear the wind outside moving through the cottonwoods. She could hear very faintly the creak of the house settling. She looked at the daguerreotype on the mantel. The woman with Emma's eyes. She wondered what she had been like, whether she had laughed easily or rarely, whether she had been the kind of woman who filled a room or the kind who made the room quieter and better just by being in it. She wondered if Silas had loved her loudly or quietly, and knew without really knowing that it had been quietly. She thought about Emma letting her place one piece of kindling in the right spot. She thought about Jake asking without malice and without cruelty whether she knew how to do anything useful. She thought about Silas standing at the mantel, arms crossed, choosing honesty over comfort. She pressed her palms flat on the table in front of her, and she made a decision, the same decision she had made in the moment she signed her name to that agency letter, the same one she had renewed with every mile of the journey. Here she was going to make this work, not because it was easy, and not because it was what she'd imagined, but because giving up was something she'd already done once in a well-lit parlor in New York with a man who'd never deserved her, and she was not going to do it again. She stood. She went to the second shelf and found the coffee and set the pot where she'd need it in the morning. She looked around the kitchen at the jars, the shelves, the basin, memorizing it. Then she went to the room on the left with her trunk and her worn-down boots and the crumpled letter still in her coat pocket, and she lay down on a narrow bed that smelled of pine wood and clean air, and she listened to the Texas night, and she did not cry. Outside in the dark of the yard, she heard the sound of boots on the porch, slow, deliberate, unhurried, and then stillness. Silas, she thought, checking the property one last time before bed, the same way he would have done every night for years, the same way he would do it tomorrow night, and the night after, and every night that followed, because that was who he was. A man who checked the fence line and turned off the lamp and got up before dawn and kept doing what needed doing no matter what. She closed her eyes. She thought, I don't know this man. And then, surprising herself completely, but I think I could. 4:30 came like a punishment. Clara had barely slept. The unfamiliar sounds of the ranch kept pulling her back from the edge of rest wind through cottonwood. Something moving in the yard. The deep silence that had none of the city noise she'd grown up in, and when the darkness outside her window was still total and the cold had crept in under the door, she heard it. Boots. Already moving through the house. Already purposeful. She lay still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she got up. She was at the cook stove before the coffee had finished, trying to remember the shelf, trying to remember where Emma had shown her the damper lever, managing barely to get the fire going without burning anything that wasn't supposed to burn. She had her hair pinned back, and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her good dress traded for the plainest one she'd packed, the dark blue wool, the one her sister had called sensible, and she had called ugly. And she was standing over the stove, trying to figure out the proportions for coffee, when Silas walked in. He stopped. He looked at the stove, at the coffee, at her. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. How much grounds? He studied her for a moment, that careful measuring look she was beginning to recognize, then moved to stand beside her and reached past her to the tin. His hand was large enough that when he scooped the grounds, one motion was sufficient. That much, he said. Right, she said. I would have used twice that. You'd have been chewing your coffee, he said. That would have been unpleasant. It is, he said, and that was as close to a joke as Silas Drifter appeared to get at 4:30 in the morning. But Clara recognized it for what it was and tucked it away. They worked in silence for a few minutes, him at the table pulling on his work gloves, her managing the coffee with considerably more concentration than the task probably warranted. Then Jake appeared in the hallway, hair still flattened from sleep boots already on, and Clara realized this was simply what mornings looked like here. No gradual easing into the day. No breakfast in bed or newspaper delivered to the door. Just darkness and cold and the immediate, unapologetic demands of living. Emma's still asleep, Jake said, dropping into his chair. Letter, Silas said. Jake looked at Clara. You made coffee. I supervised the coffee, Clara said honestly. Your father did the critical part. Jake seemed to find this acceptable. He pulled the cornbread left from the night before toward himself and broke off a piece with the unself-conscious appetite of a child who never questioned whether food would be there. Pa says you're from Manhattan. That's right. Is it true they have buildings so tall you can't see the top? Some of them, Clara said. You have to lean your head back. Jake chewed this alongside his cornbread. Doesn't seem natural, he decided. No, Clara agreed. I suppose it doesn't. Silas stood and drained his cup in one long pull and set it on the table. South fence needs checking, he said to Jake. After that, the east water trough. Yes, sir. Miss Ashford. Silas looked at her. Emma will be up within the hour. She'll show you the garden and the chickens. He paused. Don't let her carry anything heavier than she can manage. She'll try. It was such a specific, quiet piece of fatherly knowledge, the understanding that his daughter's stubbornness exceeded her size, that Clara felt it land somewhere she hadn't expected. I'll watch for it, she said. He put his hat on and went out with Jake at his heels, and the house went back to its particular silence, and Clara stood in the kitchen with her two strong opinions about buildings and her not yet adequate opinions about coffee, and waited for the smaller of the two drifter children to wake up. Emma appeared without announcement. One moment the hallway was empty, the next Emma was standing at its edge in her dress and boots, her braid from last night only half fallen, watching Clara with those deep, careful eyes. Good morning, Clara said. Emma nodded. Your father said you'd show me the garden. Emma's chin dipped again. She went to the shelf and got herself a piece of cornbread and ate it standing methodically, not rushed, just efficient in the way of someone who has decided that sitting down for breakfast alone is an unnecessary step. Then she went to the door and looked back at Clara. Clara followed. The garden was larger than she'd expected. Emma moved through it with a proprietary certainty, pointing at things beans, squash a row of something Clara identified eventually as carrots, and Clara followed along, naming them aloud as a kind of confirmation, and Emma would nod once if she got it right, and say nothing if she got it wrong, which Clara found both challenging and fair. The chickens were a disaster. Not a catastrophic one. But when Clara reached into the first nesting box, the way Emma silently indicated, she startled the hen inside, who responded by expressing herself with wings and sound in a way that sent Clara backward 3 full steps, and Emma, for the first time since Clara had arrived, made a sound. It was a laugh. Small quickly smothered both hands coming up to cover her mouth. But it was a laugh real and bright and entirely childlike, and it lit her face in a way that made Clara see briefly and startlingly what Emma might look like when the careful quietness wasn't something she needed to wear. I take it that's not the right approach, Clara said, pressing her hand to her chest. Emma shook her head. She moved to the box, reached in slowly, spoke something to the hen in a low murmur that Clara couldn't quite hear, and retrieved the egg with a confidence so complete the hen barely ruffled. Show me, Clara said. Emma looked at her. Then she moved aside and waited. Clara went back to the box. She breathed. She moved slowly the way Emma had moved, and she said, feeling slightly ridiculous, Excuse me, ma'am, to the hen, and reached in and came out with a warm brown egg intact in her palm. When she turned around, Emma was watching her with an expression that was not quite approval, but was closer to it than anything Clara had received in the past 24 hours. She held up one finger. One down, Clara said. How many more? Emma held up 8 fingers. 8, Clara said. All right. She squared her shoulders. Let's go. By the time they'd gotten through all 9 boxes, Clara was charged with 7. Emma handling the 2 she'd privately decided were the most temperamental. Something between them had shifted. Nothing dramatic, no declarations. Just the small specific warmth of 2 people who have accomplished a task together and both know it. They were walking back to the house eggs gathered in Emma's basket when Emma stopped. Clara stopped beside her. Emma was looking toward the south field where the fence line ran. Her brow was furrowed in a way that didn't look like a child's expression of simple confusion, but something more considered, more worried. "What is it?" Clara asked. Emma turned and looked at her, opened her mouth, then very quietly, very carefully. "Jake went that way. Your father sent him to check the fence," Clara said. Emma's frown deepened. She shook her head, not contradicting Clara's words, but adding something to them. She looked at the field again. "Emma," Clara said, keeping her voice level. "Is something wrong with that fence?" A pause. Then Emma touched her own arm just below the elbow. A strange gesture. "Did something happen to Jake there before?" Clara asked. Emma dropped her hand, said nothing, but her eyes were telling a story her mouth wouldn't. Before Clara could ask anything further, they heard it, Jake's voice from somewhere in the direction of the south field, carrying clear and sharp across the still morning air. Not words, just the shape of a voice raised in urgency, and both of them started moving at the same time. What they found was not a catastrophe, but it was close enough to make Clara's heart do something violent in her chest. Jake was on the ground on the far side of the fence, his back against a post, holding his right arm against his body. The wire that had been pulled loose from the post-old wire, rusted at the joints with edges that had no interest in being merciful, had caught him when the post shifted unexpectedly under his weight. He was not crying. His jaw was set exactly like his father's. "I'm fine," he said immediately when he saw them. "It's fine." "Show me your arm," Clara said. "It's fine, Miss Ashford." "Jake." She was through the fence before she'd consciously decided to move, and she crouched in front of him and said again more quietly, "Show me your arm." He looked at her for a moment with the particular conflict of a boy who has been told by every instinct he possesses that showing hurt is a weakness, and who is underneath all of that, still 8 years old and in pain. Then he extended his arm. The cut ran from just below his elbow to his wrist, not deep enough to be truly dangerous, but long and angry, and already beginning to swell at the edges. Clara looked at it and felt the cold and practical part of herself take over the part that had once handled her mother's fainting spells and her father's illness, and the particular domestic crises that high society women were supposed to manage behind the appearance of perfect composure. "It needs cleaning and binding," she said. "Can you walk?" "I said I'm fine," Jake said. "I know you did," Clara said. "Can you walk?" His jaw tightened further. Then he stood in one motion without using the arm. "Yes," he said. Emma had not made a sound. She was standing just outside the fence with the egg basket still in both hands, her face white and still. Clara caught her eye over Jake's shoulder. "He's all right," Clara said. "It's not as bad as it looks." Emma looked at her brother, at his arm, back at Clara. She gave one small, tight nod. "Come on," Clara said to Jake. "Let's get back to the house." He walked beside her, and did not ask for help, and did not complain, and she stayed close enough to catch him if he needed it, and far enough to let him pretend he didn't. And Emma walked on his other side, and none of them spoke, and Clara thought with a sudden fierce clarity, these children have been getting through hard things alone for 2 years. And the automatic instinct of both of them is still to say they're fine. Back in the house, she found clean cloth and boiled water, and the small bottle of carbolic she'd spotted on the shelf the night before. She'd noticed it, because she'd been noticing everything cataloging the house, the way she cataloged everything she needed to understand. Jake sat at the table and held his arm still while she cleaned the wound, and the only sign he gave of the pain was a single sharp intake of breath when the carbolic hit, and then silence. "You should tell your father," Clara said, wrapping the cloth. "It'll worry him," Jake said. "He'll be more worried if he finds out you hid it." Jake looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Because," Clara said, tying off the bandage with a firm, neat knot, "a man who gets up at 4:30 every morning and walks the fence line every night is not a man who wants things hidden from him. He wants to know what's real." Jake was quiet for a moment. Then, "Pa's not big on talking about things." "No," Clara agreed. "But there's a difference between not talking about something and not knowing about it." Jake considered this with the same seriousness he brought to everything. "Like how he doesn't talk about Mama," he said. "But it doesn't mean he's forgotten." Clara's hands stilled on the knot. "Like that," she said. Exactly like that. Emma, who had set the egg basket down by the door and had been standing very still and very quiet for the past several minutes, made a small sound. Not quite a word. Clara and Jake both looked at her. She was looking at Jake's bandaged arm. Her hands were knotted at her sides. "Emmy," Jake said, in a voice completely different from the one he used for everything else. Softer, more careful, the voice of a brother who has been protecting his little sister for long enough that it has become as natural as breathing. "I'm okay." Emma's chin trembled. Once. Then she pressed her lips together, and it stopped, and she lifted her chin, and she looked at Clara with those deep, serious eyes, and she said more words than she'd said since Clara arrived. "You fixed it." "I did," Clara said. "Good," Emma said. And then she went and picked up the egg basket and carried it to the counter and began to put the eggs away one by one with her back straight and her hands steady. Jake looked at Clara. His expression was something she couldn't fully read. "She didn't let the other one do that," he said carefully. Clara stilled. "The other one, the woman who came before you," Jake said. "From the agency. She was here for 4 days. Emma wouldn't let her near the chickens or the garden or anything. She left and said the children were—" He stopped. "Said what?" Clara asked. Jake's voice dropped flat and matter-of-fact in the way of someone quoting something that was said about him as though it weren't about him at all. Wild, difficult, beyond managing. Clara looked at the back of Emma's head, at the careful, deliberate way she was setting each egg in its place, at the particular kind of self-possession that was not coldness, but protection, the armor of a child who had lost too much too fast and had learned the very hard lesson that letting someone in meant risking them leaving. "She was wrong," Clara said. Jake looked at her. "She was wrong," Clara said again more quietly. "There is nothing wild or difficult about either of you. There's just 2 children who've had to be braver than children should have to be." Jake was quiet for a long time. Emma didn't turn around, but her hands slowed on the eggs. "You're different," Jake said finally. Not a compliment exactly, not quite an accusation, just an observation offered with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to dress his conclusions in softer language. "Different from what?" Clara asked. "From what I thought you'd be," he said. "I thought you'd be like—" He paused, searching. "Like glass. Breakable. The kind of person who stands in the middle of a room and waits for everyone else to move around her." Clara almost smiled. "And now?" Jake looked at her bandage work, at his arm. "You didn't flinch," he said, "when you saw it. You just did what needed doing." "That's all there is to do," Clara said, "when something needs doing." Jake nodded slowly. The nod of someone who has just filed a piece of information away in the place where important things are kept. It was another hour before Silas came back. He came through the door the way he always did, directly, purposefully, already scanning the room out of habit, and he saw Jake's arm, before Jake had a chance to say anything, and his face did something immediate and wordless that Clara recognized as a parent's particular fear, the fear that runs faster than thought. "What happened?" he said. Not a question, a demand. "The south fence post shifted," Jake said. "Wire caught me. Let me see it." Jake extended his arm. Silas unwrapped the bandage with careful, practiced hands, looked at the wound beneath, looked at the bandage, looked at his son's face. "You walked back on your own?" "Yes, sir." "Head feel all right? No dizziness?" "No, sir." Silas rewrapped the arm slightly differently than Clara had she noticed, more evenly tensioned, and held his son's elbow in both hands for a moment. Just held it. No words, just the weight of his hands and the steadiness of them, and Jake sat very still and let that be enough. Then Silas looked up, across the table at Clara. "You did this," he said, meaning the bandaging, the carbolic, the cleaning. "Yes," she said. He looked at it again, at the neatness of the original work, at the carbolic on the shelf where she'd left it out for visibility. He looked back at her, and in his careful gray eyes was something she hadn't seen there before. Not gratitude exactly, and not surprise exactly, but something at the overlap of both. Something that a man who guarded his expressions the way Silas Drifter did let show only when he'd been caught off guard and hadn't had time to put it away. "Thank you," he said. It was 2 words, plain and direct and entirely without decoration. And it landed with more weight than any elaborate compliment Clara had received in any gaslit parlor in New York. "It needed doing," she said, and Silas Drifter looked at her, really looked at her for the second time since she'd arrived, and said nothing more. But he didn't look away either. Not right away. He held her gaze for a moment that was exactly long enough to mean something, and then he put his hat back on and said to Jake, "After lunch, you and I look at that post." "Yes, sir," Jake said. "And next time," Silas said, pausing at the door, "you tell me straight off." Jake's chin dipped. "Yes, sir." Silas went back out. The door closed behind him. Jake exhaled a long, quiet breath that suggested he'd been holding it and looked at Clara. "He's not mad," Jake told her as though she might need the translation. "I know," Clara said. "He gets quiet when he's relieved," Jake said. "Everybody thinks it's the other thing, but it's not." Clara looked at the door that Silas had just gone through, at the place where he'd stood, at the plain, particular weight of a man putting his hands around his son's arm and holding on. "I'm learning that," she said quietly. "How to read him." Jake picked up his fork with his good arm. "He's not that hard," he said, "once you know what you're looking at." And Clara thought, no, maybe he isn't. The days began to stack up on each other, each one a little less foreign than the one before. Clara learned the rhythms of the ranch the way you learn a language you were never taught in school, by immersion, by mistake, by the particular embarrassment of getting something wrong in front of people who know better and choosing to try again anyway. She learned which chickens would tolerate her and which would not. She learned that the water from the east pump ran cold and clean, while the west pump had a handle that stuck and required a specific technique involving her full body weight and a kind of controlled frustration. She learned that Jake's version of "I'll be back in a minute" meant anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour and a half, and that Emma's silence at breakfast was not sadness, but concentration. The child thought deeply before she was ready to engage with the world, and the world Clara was beginning to believe would do well to respect that. She was learning Silas too, slowly. In the same way you learn a terrain by walking it repeatedly, by noticing which ground was solid and which shifted underfoot, by paying attention to what was always there and what only appeared in certain light. He was not a man who wasted words. But he was not. She was discovering a man who wasted anything. Not motion, not effort, not the particular attention he brought to everything he did. She had watched him that second morning teach Jake how to retension the repaired fence post. His hands guiding the boys without impatience, explaining once and then letting Jake do it, stepping back, watching, correcting only when correction was genuinely needed. She had watched him that evening sit beside Emma at the table, while the girl worked through a arithmetic problem in her school primer, and she had seen the way he waited, not rushing her, not filling the silence with hints, just present, solid, letting Emma come to the answer herself, and rewarding it not with praise, but with a single nod that somehow contained more affirmation than most people managed in paragraphs. It was on the 4th morning that Clara burned the biscuits. Not slightly. Completely. She had been so focused on not undercooking the center, a mistake she'd made twice already, that she'd overcompensated, and what came out of the oven were 12 objects that could most charitably be described as a fire hazard. Jake stared at them with the expression of a child, attempting with genuine effort to find something diplomatic to say. Emma picked one up, tapped it on the table, and set it back down. Clara pressed her lips together. "They're terrible," she said. Jake started. "Jake," Clara said. "They're real bad," he admitted. "I know." She sat down, looked at the biscuits, felt something between laughter and despair moving through her chest. "I followed the proportions exactly." "Did you use the baking powder or the baking soda?" Silas asked from the doorway. Clara turned. He was leaning against the frame arms, crossed hat already on. "The white powder in the jar on the right," she said. Silas closed his eyes, briefly. "That's the salt." Silence. "How much did you use?" he asked. She told him. Jake made a sound that was absolutely a smothered laugh. Clara looked at the biscuits. 12 small, perfectly formed, completely inedible salt rocks. "I made 12 salt biscuits," she said. "You made 12 very committed salt biscuits," Silas said. And there it was again, that fractional movement at the corner of his mouth, that barely there concession to something that wanted to be a smile. Emma looked up at Clara. Her eyes were bright. Her lips were pressed together very hard. "Go ahead," Clara told her. Emma laughed. Not the small, quickly covered sound from the chicken coop. This was fuller genuine, a child's real laugh, and it changed her whole face, and Jake immediately joined it, and Clara sat there in front of her catastrophic biscuits and felt something warm move through her chest that had nothing to do with the cook stove. Even Silas's mouth gave up its restraint for a moment, just a moment. But she saw it. "I'll teach you the shelf system today," he said, "before you salt anything else." "That would be wise," Clara agreed. He did teach her, standing at the shelf in the kitchen, systematically moving each jar and tin and explaining its contents in the same plain, direct way he explained everything. Clara listened carefully and asked specific questions, and he answered each one without impatience. And by the end of it, she understood that what looked like a disorganized collection of containers was in fact a highly organized system that had simply never been labeled because the person who built it had never imagined anyone else would need to use it. "Your wife arranged it this way?" Clara asked before she'd entirely decided to. The question landed in the kitchen and sat there. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. Clara nodded. "Didn't push. He surprised her." "She was a good cook," he said. Not painfully, just factually, the way he said most things. "Better than me. The children got used to—" He stopped. "Emma has her way of doing things because of how she learned them." "She learned from her mother," Clara said. "Yes." Clara looked at the shelf, the jars. The careful system, the order that a woman she would never meet had built into the bones of this house. "I'll try not to change things that don't need changing," she said. Silas looked at her. It was a measuring look, but there was something different in it this time. Less wariness, more consideration. "Some things could use changing," he said, which was Clara understood more than he'd intended to say. He picked up his hat from the table. "The baking powder is the jar second from the left. Third shelf." "Second from the left. Third shelf," Clara repeated. He went out. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment looking at the shelf. Then she picked up the jar of baking powder, held it in her hand for a moment, and set it back in exactly the right place. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday in the form of a wagon. Clara was in the garden with Emma. They had developed a genuine routine, now the two of them working through the rows with an efficiency that had grown naturally out of repetition when she heard it coming down the road, and Emma heard it too, and something happened to the child's face that Clara noticed immediately. A tightening, a closing off, the way a door swings shut when wind catches it. "Emma," Clara said. "Who is it?" Emma's eyes tracked the wagon. Her hands stilled in the dirt. She didn't answer. The wagon pulled up to the front of the house, and the man who climbed down was broad and well-dressed by Sagebrush Hollow standards, not rich, but deliberate about appearance in a way that communicated he wanted to be seen as significant. He had a thick mustache and the particular walk of someone accustomed to arriving places and being received. Clara put him at 50, maybe a little more, with the kind of face that knew how to arrange itself into friendliness without actually achieving it. He saw Clara before he saw Emma. "Well now," he said, "you must be the new Mrs. Drifter." "Miss Ashford," Clara said. "And you are—" He smiled wide, immediate the smile of a man who'd decided he liked the look of her. "Gerald Hatch. I run the Hatch Ranch east of here. Biggest operation in the county." He said it the way men say things they believe should settle matters. "I've got business with Silas." "He's in the south field," Clara said. "I can let him know you're here. Much appreciated." Hatch's eyes moved past her, found Emma still crouched at the garden edge, and the smile contracted not by much but enough. "Hello there, Emma." Emma said nothing. She had gone very still in the particular way a small animal goes still when something larger moves nearby. Clara stepped without thinking about it slightly to the left, between Hatch and Emma. "I'll get Silas," she said. She sent Jake, who materialized from the direction of the barn at the exact right moment, the way Jake always seemed to when something interesting was happening. He took in Hatch with one long look, his expression flat and unchildlike, and ran for the south field without being asked twice. By the time Silas came back, Clara had positioned herself at the porch with Emma close beside her, and she'd offered Hatch water, because it was the appropriate thing to do, and kept the interaction on her terms. Hatch had accepted the water and spent the waiting time telling her things about his ranch that she hadn't asked about and didn't particularly want to know, and she had listened pleasantly and said very little and watched his eyes. His eyes, she noticed, were always slightly somewhere else, never quite where his attention claimed to be. Silas came directly to the porch, Jake at his heels, and the change in Hatch when he saw him was interesting to observe. The smile widened, the posture shifted, the entire presentation reorganized itself into something between deference and pressure, and Clara thought these two men have a history that isn't comfortable. "Silas," Hatch said. "Good to see you. I was just getting acquainted with your new—" He gestured at Clara in a way that was technically polite and actually something else. "Miss Ashford," Silas said. "What is it you need, Gerald?" The first name use was not warmth. Clara could hear the difference. Hatch leaned against the porch rail like a man who had decided to be comfortable regardless of whether he'd been invited to. "I wanted to talk to you about the water rights on the North Creek. Deed's office says the original survey's got some ambiguity." Silas's face did not change. "The original survey says clearly that the creek runs through drifter land." "Well, that's the thing." Hatch smiled in the way of someone about to be very reasonable. "Old surveys weren't always careful. I've had a man look at it. Seems like there's a good argument the north boundary is off by half a mile." "Half a mile," Silas said flatly. "Give or take." "That half mile is where my east pasture sits," Silas said, "along with 3 years of fence work and my primary water source." Hatch spread his hands. "Silas, I'm not trying to make trouble. I just think it'd be worth sitting down with the county clerk getting it sorted properly, friendly-like." Clara was watching Silas's hands. They had not moved. They were perfectly still at his sides, which she was beginning to understand was not relaxation, but its precise opposite, the complete deliberate stillness of a man who has decided exactly how much of his reaction the situation deserves. "I'll look at the deed," Silas said. "Same as I always have, and it'll say the same thing it's always said." Hatch nodded slowly with an expression of manufactured patience. "Of course. You do that." He straightened, settled his hat. His eyes moved to Clara again, then to Emma, then back to Silas. "Nice to have a woman on the place again," he said. "Good for the children." He said it like a generous observation. It landed like something else. Silas said nothing. The silence held for exactly long enough. Hatch climbed back into his wagon. As he picked up the reins, he looked at Silas one more time. "Think about what I said. Friendly resolution is better than the alternative." He said it pleasantly. He drove away pleasantly. He left behind something that was not pleasant at all. Jake watched the wagon go. His jaw was his father's jaw set hard. "I don't like him," he said. "Jake," Silas said. "I know," Jake said. "But I don't." Emma had come to stand beside Clara. She wasn't touching her. Emma rarely touched anyone, but she was close, closer than she usually stood. Clara looked down at her. Emma was watching the wagon disappear, and her face was doing that closed-off door-shut thing again. "Emma," Clara said quietly, "has he been here before?" Emma looked up at her. Then, with a deliberateness that felt important, she nodded. "When your father wasn't home—" Emma's chin dipped once. Clara looked at Silas. He had caught the exchange. His eyes had gone a shade darker, not angry, or not only angry, but the particular expression of a man who has just been told something he'd suspected, but not confirmed. "Go inside," he said to the children. "Both of you." Jake went without argument, which told Clara he'd read the room. Emma went too, pausing only to look once more at Clara before she disappeared through the door. Clara stayed on the porch. "You don't have to," Silas started. "What does he actually want?" Clara asked. Silas was quiet. "Not the creek," Clara said. "Or not only the creek. What does he actually want?" Silas looked at the road where Hatch's wagon had gone. "This land has been in debt since my wife got sick," he said. "Medical costs. Then the funeral. Then a bad year with the cattle." He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without drama, the way you state facts you've already made your peace with. "Hatch has been watching this property for 3 years. He knows the numbers. And the water rights dispute gives him a legal entry point," Clara said. Silas looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, but a recalibration. The adjustment a person makes when someone understands something faster than expected. "Yes," he said. "Do you have the deed?" "Inside. In the trunk under my bed." "Then we look at it tonight," Clara said. "And tomorrow you go to the county clerk yourself before Hatch has a chance to have another conversation with them." Silas studied her. "You know about deeds. My father was in property investment," Clara said. "I spent half my childhood watching him go over documents at the dinner table. I know what a fraudulent survey argument looks like." She paused. "And I know what a man who makes friendly threats looks like, because my father dealt with those too." The silence between them now was different from any of the silences that had come before. This one had weight to it. Not the weight of distance, but the weight of something being considered carefully by a man who did not consider things carelessly. "You're full of surprises, Miss Ashford," Silas said, quietly. "Clara," she said. He looked at her. "If we're going to fight a land dispute together," she said, "you might as well call me Clara." Something moved through his eyes that she felt in her chest before she had a name for it. Then he looked back at the road. "All right," he said. "Clara." Her name in his mouth was nothing elaborate. Just 2 syllables spoken plainly the way he spoke everything. But she felt it settle somewhere that mattered, and she did not examine that too closely because there were more important things to attend to. There was a deed to find and a man to get to the county clerk before sundown tomorrow, and 2 children inside who had been afraid of Gerald Hatch coming to this property while their father wasn't home. And that last fact, that specific fact, had taken up residence in the cold, practical part of Clara Ashford's chest and was generating a heat that surprised her with its intensity. She was not sure exactly when this family had become something she intended to protect. She was fairly certain it had already happened. "After supper," she said, "we look at the deed." "After supper," Silas agreed. He held the door open for her. She walked in past him close enough to catch the smell of sun and leather and the specific something that was just him. And she went to the stove and checked the pot, and began to put supper together with the deliberate, organized focus of a woman who had decided what she was here for. Behind her, she heard Silas cross the room, stop at the hallway entrance, and say to the children in his steady, carrying voice, "Come on out, it's all right." Jake came immediately. Emma came behind him, and when she came through the doorway, she went without drama or announcement to stand beside Clara at the stove. Clara handed her the wooden spoon. Emma stirred. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. The deed was older than Clara expected. Silas brought it to the table after supper, a folded document yellowed at the creases. The ink in some places faded to the color of dried grass. He set it flat and stood back, and Clara sat down and spread it carefully with both hands, and read. She read it twice. Then she sat back. "This is clear," she said. "I know it's clear," Silas said. "Then Hatch knows it's clear, too." She looked up. "Which means the survey argument isn't his real strategy. It's a distraction." Silas pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He had his arms on the table and his hands laced together, and he was watching her with that careful, considering expression she'd come to recognize, the one that meant he was listening harder than he appeared to be. What do you think the real strategy is? Clara looked at the deed again. At the date. At the property boundaries, spelled out in the precise formal language of a land office 30 years ago. He said you've had debt since your wife got sick, she said. He knows the numbers. She tapped the document. This deed is clean. He can't challenge it and win. But if he ties you up in a legal dispute long enough, files enough paperwork, forces you to spend money on a lawyer. I'll run short, Silas said flatly. And then he makes you an offer on the property, Clara said. When you're out of options and he's holding the deadline. The silence that followed was not the comfortable working silence she'd grown used to between them. This one was harder. How long have you known this? She asked. Suspected it, Silas said. For a while. Why didn't you? She stopped herself. She knew why. Because there had been no one to tell. Because for 2 years, he had been the one who held everything together, who absorbed every threat and every fear and every hard fact. And there had been no one on the other side of this table to say, tell me the real problem and mean it. All right, she said. Tomorrow morning, first thing, you go to the county clerk. You have the deed recorded, formally witnessed, filed. Make it impossible for him to claim any ambiguity in the county records. I was going to do that, Silas said. I know, but go early, before Hatch does. Silas looked at her. You think he'd go tonight? I think a man who's been planning this for 3 years doesn't sleep in, she said. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and went to the shelf and came back with a tin of coffee, because apparently some conversations required a second round, and Clara moved the deed carefully to the side while he poured, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight and worked through it, every angle, every contingency, every move Hatch might make, and what the counter to it was. Silas was not a talkative man, but he was a precise one, and once Clara had established that she was not offering opinions but working through the problem with him, the conversation found its own rhythm and moved quickly. It was past 10 when Jake appeared in the hallway in his nightshirt. You're both still up, he said with the tone of someone who has been trying to sleep and finding it difficult. Go back to bed, Silas said. Is it about Hatch? Jake. I'm just asking. Yes, Clara said, because she'd learned that Jake responded better to honesty than to redirection. We're dealing with it. Your father has a plan. Jake looked at his father. A good one. Silas said nothing. Yes, Clara said. Jake considered this. Then he looked at the two of them sitting across from each other at the table, the lamp between them, the deed to one side, the coffee cups, and something in his face registered this arrangement as something new, something that hadn't existed a week ago, and filed it somewhere. Okay, he said. Good night. Good night. They both said, and Jake disappeared, and Clara and Silas looked at the space where he'd been, and then at each other, and the corner of Silas's mouth moved. He doesn't miss much, Clara said. Never has, Silas said. The county clerk's office opened at 8. Silas was there at 7:45. Clara knew because she watched him ride out before dawn. She'd been up already because she was always up before dawn now, because 4:30 had become as natural as breathing, whether she wanted it to or not, and she tracked the time and fed the children and managed the morning with a competence that surprised even herself. And when Silas came back at mid-morning with the deed formally recorded and 2 witness signatures and the clerk's official stamp, he handed her the document, and she looked at it and felt a satisfaction so clean and solid it was almost physical. Well done, she said. You're the one who said go early, he said. You're the one who went. He looked at the document. Hatch's man was at the clerk's office when I arrived, he said. Sitting in the wagon across the road. Clara looked up. He sent someone to watch. Left when he saw me come out with the clerk. Good, Clara said. Let him report back. Silas looked at her. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window, and it caught the gray of his eyes, and she looked at them for 1 second longer than she'd planned. You enjoy this, he said, not an accusation, more like someone recognizing something unexpected. I enjoy solving problems, Clara said. My father said it was unbecoming for a woman. My mother agreed. My sister thought it was funny. She turned back to the stove. Turns out there are places where it's useful instead. She heard him set his hat on the table. It's useful here, he said, quietly. She kept her back to him, kept her hands busy, felt the words settle somewhere warm. Coffee's on, she said. Hatch did not come back that day, or the next. But on the third morning they found the east pasture fence down. Not wind damage, not age. Cut. 3 sections clean through, and 20 feet of it pulled from the posts and left in a pile that no storm had ever made. Silas stood in front of it and said nothing for a long time, and Clara stood beside him, and Jake stood on his other side, and even Jake said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. How long would it take to fix? Clara asked. A day, Silas said. Maybe 2. Can the cattle stay in the north pasture that long? If they don't spook, he said. Jake's head came up. Pa, he said. The Harmon brothers' place is north of the cattle trail. If someone ran a sound through there... I know, Silas said. What does that mean? Clara asked. Silas looked at the fence. It means this isn't about the fence, he said. Someone cuts the east pasture fence and then runs a noise through the north side. The cattle go straight through the gap and onto the creek property. Property that Hatch claims is in dispute. Clara felt the cold clarity of it. And then his men find cattle on disputed land. And he has a complaint filed at the sheriff's office by noon, Silas said. Can he do that? He can file anything he wants, Silas said. Filing it and winning it are different things. But it costs me a lawyer. He looked at Jake. Go back to the house. Stay with your sister. Pa, Jake. Jake's jaw set hard. He looked at Clara as though seeking a second opinion, or perhaps a witness to his objection, and Clara gave him a level look that said, This is not the moment, and he heard it, and he went. Silas moved to his horse. I'll fix what I can today and sleep out here tonight, he said. Make sure nothing else gets touched. You can't fix 3 sections alone in a day, Clara said. I can get enough up to hold them. I'll help, she said. He looked at her over his horse's neck. You don't know fencing. Then teach me, she said. The same way you taught Jake the post. You explain it once and I'll do it. We'll move faster. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, get your gloves. She did not have proper work gloves. She had the white traveling gloves that were already beyond saving and a pair of wool ones that Emma had silently produced from somewhere after the first cold morning, and she took the wool ones and she went out and she learned fencing. It was not pleasant work. The wire was exactly as indifferent to her hands as it had been to Jake's arm, and there was a specific technique to tensioning it that required more upper body strength than she'd known she had, and more patience than she'd known she could access. Silas showed her once, corrected her once, and after that, let her work, and she worked. And they did not talk much because there was too much to do. But the silence was the good kind, the kind with purpose in it. 2 people moving through a shared task with shared focus. By mid-afternoon, they had 2 of the 3 sections repaired. By late afternoon, the sky changed. Clara felt it before she understood it, a shift in the air, a particular weight, a change in the way the cattle were moving in the north pasture. They were pacing the far fence, moving together heads up, restless in a way they hadn't been an hour ago. Silas, she said. He was already watching them. Then, they heard it. From the north, not close but not distant either, a sound she couldn't immediately identify. A crack, then another. Not thunder, not random. Deliberate. Repeating. Somebody's driving them, Silas said, and his voice had gone to something very flat and very controlled. He moved immediately, and his movement had a different quality now, not the steady, unhurried efficiency of ranch work, but something faster, sharper, the movement of a man in whose body the situation has registered as genuine danger, and who has already decided exactly what to do about it. Get behind the fence, he said to Clara. What are you, Clara? He looked at her directly. His eyes were not afraid, they were focused completely on the thing he was calculating. Get behind the fence and stay there. I need to know you're clear." She went. Not because she was afraid, but because she heard what he was actually saying. "I can't do what I need to do if I'm worried about where you are." What happened in the next few minutes was something Clara would carry for the rest of her life. Not as something she watched, but as something that entered her and stayed. The cattle came through the north fence gap like water finding a break in a dam. Not all at once, but building the first few moving fast, and then the mass of them behind. And the sound was enormous. The ground under her feet actually transmitting the weight of it. And Silas was already moving lateral to them, his horse responding to him, the way an extension of himself responds, rather than a separate creature. And he did something with his body and his horse and his voice. A long, sharp sound sustained carrying over the noise, and the shape of the herd changed. He didn't stop them. He redirected them, working the edge, keeping pace, pushing the angle of the movement 3 degrees and then 5, and then enough the herd curving away from the creek property and back toward the south. Away from Hatch's claimed territory, away from the gap in the east fence, until they were running parallel to the property line and not across it. She had seen men back home manage things, manage business, manage social situations, manage the delicate machinery of wealth and power with careful, deliberate skill. She had thought she understood what competence looked like. She had not seen anything like this. By the time it was over, the cattle were in the south pasture, and Silas was walking his horse back toward her, and the light was going amber and long, and Clara was standing with her back to the fence she'd helped repair, and both hands flat against the post, and she felt her own heartbeat very clearly. Silas swung down from his horse and looked at the cattle, then at the gap they'd come through, then at her. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that because her hands were not. He looked at her hands against the post. She made herself lower them. "That was deliberately done," she said. "Yes." "He'll know it didn't work." "Yes." "What does he do next?" Silas looked toward the north. His jaw was tight, his eyes calculating. "Something that leaves less to chance," he said. The something came 2 days later, and it did not come from Hatch directly. It came from town in the form of Mrs. Hilda Pierce, who ran the dry goods store, and was the primary mechanism by which all information in Sagebrush Hollow moved between people, and what she delivered was not a threat, but a story. The story was that Clara Ashford was not properly married to Silas Drifter. It moved through town the way those stories always do, quickly, quietly through the medium of helpful concern. That the agency paperwork hadn't been filed. That the arrangement was improper. That those poor children were living with a woman who had no legal standing in their household. No real claim. Nothing binding her to them or them to her. Clara heard it from Mrs. Pierce herself, who came to the ranch on the pretense of checking whether Clara needed anything from the store and delivered the information with an expression that managed to be simultaneously pitying and gratified. After she left, Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment very still. Emma was at the table behind her. She had heard everything. "Is it true?" Emma asked. And it was the most words strung together in the most direct question that Emma Drifter had ever addressed to her. Clara turned around. She looked at the child, at the careful brown eyes, at the hands flat on the table, at the particular courage it took to ask a question whose answer you were genuinely afraid of. "The paperwork is a question I need to look into," Clara said honestly. "I don't know exactly what state it's in." Emma absorbed this. "But are you leaving?" she asked. The word leaving in Emma's mouth had a specific weight to it that Clara felt down to her feet. Because Emma Drifter had said leaving before to someone she loved, and that person had not come back, and the child had spent 2 years learning to live with the shape of that absence. Clara crossed the kitchen and crouched in front of her. "No," she said. "I am not leaving." Emma looked at her for a long time. "Even if—" "No," Clara said again. "Emma, look at me." She waited until the child's eyes met hers directly. "I am not leaving this house. I am not leaving you or your brother. Whatever the paperwork says, whatever that woman or anyone else says, I am here and I intend to stay, And nothing Gerald Hatch or anyone like him does is going to change that. Emma's chin did its one small tremble. Then she pressed her lips together. Then she reached out very slowly and took Clara's hand. She didn't squeeze it hard, she just held it. Small fingers wrapped around Clara's light, and careful the way Emma did everything with extraordinary precision about what she actually meant. Clara held on. She was still holding Emma's hand when she heard boots on the porch, and Silas came through the door. He took in the scene. Clara crouched Emma's hand in hers, and everything about the question he'd been forming in the doorway shifted. "Someone talk to him," Clara said, standing but not letting Emma go. "The paperwork story. Hatch's idea, or the town's idea of helping, I'm not sure which, but it's out." Silas's face did not move. His eyes went to Emma. Emma looked back at him with those steady, serious eyes. "She asked if I was leaving," Clara said quietly. "I told her no." Silas looked at Clara then. He looked at her the way the morning light caught things directly, without the filtering of distance or wariness, without the careful management of expression she'd seen him practice every day since she arrived. And what was in his face was something she hadn't seen there before, something unguarded and specific, and meant entirely for her. He crossed the room in 4 steps. He stopped in front of her, closer than he'd ever stood, and he said very quietly, so that only she could hear it clearly above Emma's head, "Are you?" Clara looked up at him. At the gray eyes that were not cold, she understood now, but deep. The way still water is deep, and at the jaw and the careful hands, and the man who had taught her fencing, and the shelf system, and hadn't flinched once when she challenged or surprised or redirected him. "I gave you my word when I stepped off that stagecoach," she said. "I don't break my word." He held her gaze. Then he exhaled one short, controlled breath and stepped back. He reached down and put his hand briefly gently on the top of Emma's head. Emma leaned into it. "I'll go see the sheriff in the morning," Silas said. "About the fencing and the herd. There are witnesses who saw the damage." "Good," Clara said. "And the paperwork question." He paused. "It's not, there's a filing the agency was supposed to complete. I don't know if they did." "We find out," Clara said, "and we handle whatever needs handling." "Together," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that direct, unguarded expression, still not quite gone, yet not quite back behind the careful distance. "Together," she said. Emma still holding Clara's hand, made a small sound. Not words. Just a sound the kind a child makes when something that has been very tight in their chest releases slightly. Clara felt it in her own chest, like an echo. Outside the wind had come up. It moved through the cottonwoods in that particular way it had in the evening. A sound like something big and patient breathing. The sheriff's name was Calhoun, and he was a man who wore his authority the way some men wear a coat that doesn't quite fit, aware of it slightly, uncomfortable, always adjusting. He listened to Silas in his office the next morning with the particular expression of someone receiving information they would prefer not to have received. And when Silas finished laying out the fence damage, the herd drive, the county clerk visit, and the timing of all 3 relative to Hatch's appearance on the property, Calhoun leaned back in his chair and was quiet for longer than Clara thought the situation warranted. Clara had come with Silas. She had not asked permission. He had not suggested she stay home. "You got proof it was Hatch's men on that north fence?" Calhoun asked. "I've got 3 cut sections and a herd that didn't spook themselves," Silas said. "That's not proof, Silas. That's circumstance." "Then let me tell you what else is circumstance," Clara said. Both men looked at her. She kept her voice level and her hands still in her lap. "Mr. Hatch visited the property the day before the fence was cut. He made a claim about the water rights that has no legal standing. The deed is now formally recorded with the clerk's office, witnessed and stamped. The day after the fence was cut, a story appeared in town questioning the validity of my marriage to Mr. Drifter. That story serves one purpose. It destabilizes this household and makes the property more vulnerable." She paused. "That's 3 moves in 4 days, Sheriff. Circumstance tends not to be that organized. Calhoun looked at her, then at Silas. She always talked like this. Frequently, Silas said. Calhoun rubbed his face. I can't arrest Gerald Hatch on circumstance, no matter how organized it is. What I can do is ride out to his place and have a conversation. Make it clear that any further incidents involving Drifter property are going to get looked at closely. That's enough, Silas said. For now. And the paperwork question, Clara said. The marriage filing. I'd like to know who started that story and on what basis. Calhoun's expression shifted something in it that looked like reluctant respect. I'll look into it, he said. Can't promise more than that. Looking into it is all I'm asking, Clara said. They rode back to the ranch in the kind of silence that comes after effort, not empty, but resting. The morning was wide and bright, and the land stretched in all directions, and Clara sat beside Silas on the wagon bench and felt the particular steadiness of someone who has done what could be done and is waiting to see if it was enough. You didn't have to do that, Silas said after a while. Do what? Come in there and lay it out the way you did. Calhoun listens to reason better than he listens to grievance. You knew that. He kept his eyes on the road. You read him in about 30 seconds. My father took me to business meetings when I was young, Clara said. He said a woman who could read a room was worth 10 men who couldn't. She paused. It was the only useful thing he ever told me. He was right, Silas said. Clara looked at his profile. At the jaw, the hat brim, the hands easy on the reins. You're not what I expected either, she said. He glanced at her. What did you expect? I don't know exactly. Someone harder, maybe. More closed. She thought about how to say the next part honestly. The man I almost married in New York was charming every moment of every day and meant none of it. I think I expected from a man this quiet that the inside would match the outside, that the distance was the whole of it. Silas was quiet. It isn't, she said. I know that now. He didn't answer immediately. The wagon moved. The cottonwoods along the property line came into view. Then, without looking at her, he said, Margaret, my wife, she used to say I was like a well, that you didn't know how deep it went until you'd let down some rope. He stopped, started again slightly rougher. She was the only person who ever bothered to. The name in his mouth was something private and weighted, and Clara received it carefully, the way you receive something fragile that has been carried a long way. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman, she said. She was, he said, simply, finally. The way you say things, you've already finished grieving and begun to carry differently. They rode the rest of the way without speaking. It was enough. The twist came from the direction Clara least expected, which was, as the best ones always are, from inside her own chest. The agency letter arrived that afternoon. Addressed to Silas, forwarded from the county seat official, and sealed. He opened it at the table while Clara was at the stove, and Jake was outside, and Emma was reading in the corner, and he read it. And his face did something she couldn't see because his back was to her, but she heard the pause and the sound of him, the stillness that replaced whatever small movements a person makes when they're simply reading, and she turned around. What is it? She asked. He set the letter on the table. He didn't say anything for a moment. The agency, he said. The filing. The original clerk who processed our arrangement left the office last month. The paperwork went to the county seat for review. He stopped. There's a question about whether the arrangement was properly witnessed on your end before you left New York. Clara came to the table. She read the letter. She read it again. It's not saying we're not married, she said carefully. It's saying they need a supplementary affidavit from me confirming I entered the arrangement voluntarily and with full knowledge of the terms. A formality. A formality that Hatch is apparently aware of, Silas said. Because if it's not filed within 30 days, the arrangement is considered incomplete. Clara looked at the date on the letter. This was sent 3 weeks ago. It was delayed at this county seat. His voice was flat. We have 9 days. 9 days. She understood in one sharp and clarifying second the complete shape of Hatch's strategy. He hadn't needed to defeat the deed. He hadn't needed to spook the cattle or cut the fence or win a single legal argument. He just needed to delay. To tie things up, create confusion. Slow everything down until the clock ran out on a piece of paperwork that, if it expired, would give him exactly the vulnerability he needed. An unmarried woman living on a man's property with no legal standing was a woman a town could decide to disapprove of, and a man who couldn't protect his family's arrangement was a man whose position in the county became precarious, and a precarious man was a man who took offers. "He's been playing a longer game than we saw," Clara said. "Yes," Silas said. "Who in the county seat had access to this letter's routing?" A pause. "Hatch has a cousin who works in the mail office," Silas said, and his voice had gone to that controlled flatness again, the one that she now understood as the sound of a man managing a very great deal of feeling with a very tight grip. Clara set the letter down. She pressed both palms flat on the table. She thought with the part of her mind that had gotten very good over the past several weeks at cutting through to the essential thing, what actually needs to happen right now. "I need to write an affidavit," she said. "Tonight. You need to take it to the county seat tomorrow at first light, not the local office. The county seat directly bypassing the mail office entirely. Witness it with the county judge, not the clerk." "The county judge is 3 hours' ride," Silas said. "Then you leave before dawn," she said. He looked at her. "You'd trust the children with—" He stopped. The question finished itself. "Yes," she said. The look he gave her was not dramatic. It was not elaborate. It was simply the look of a man who has been holding everything alone for a very long time, and who has just had someone step up beside him and take hold of the other end, and who is feeling the specific and unfamiliar relief of a weight distributed between two people instead of pressing down on one. "I'll get paper," he said. They wrote the affidavit together, Silas dictating the legal language he knew from the original filing, Clara writing it out in her clear, educated hand, both of them reading each sentence aloud and confirming it before she set it down. It took 2 hours. Jake came in and understood from the room that this was not a moment for questions, and made himself useful, boiling water and cutting bread without being asked, and Emma fell asleep in her chair in the corner somewhere around 9 o'clock, the primer still open in her lap. When it was done, Clara signed it. She signed it with the same pen and the same hand and the same decision she'd signed the original agency letter with months ago in New York, in a parlor that felt like a different life. But this signature felt different. That one had been an escape. This one was a choice. Silas rode out before 4. He was back before noon, and he came through the door with the stamped and witnessed document in his hand and set it on the table without a word, and Clara looked at the judge's seal and the date and the official notation, and something in her that had been holding tension since the previous afternoon released all at once. "Done," Silas said. "Done," she agreed. Jake, who had been watching from the hallway, released a breath loud enough to be heard across the room. "Good," he said with feeling. "Were you listening to all of this?" Clara asked him. "Most of it," Jake said without apology. "Emma was too till she fell asleep. She knows more than you think." "I know that," Clara said. Emma appeared behind her brother. She looked at the document on the table. She looked at Clara. "It's fixed?" she asked. "It's fixed," Clara said. Emma considered this. Then she went to the stove and picked up the wooden spoon and began stirring the pot that had been sitting there since morning, because Emma Drifter's way of marking a moment was always through the next useful thing, and Clara found she loved that about her completely, and without reservation. The afternoon brought one more thing from Hatch, and it was the last. He came himself this time without the wagon, alone on horseback, and he did not come to the door. He stopped at the gate and called out, and Silas went to meet him, and Clara stood on the porch and watched. She couldn't hear all of it, but she could hear the shape of it. Hatch's voice carrying a different quality, now less smooth, the pleasant surface thinner. And she could see Silas's posture, which did not change a degree. And she watched the moment when Silas said something 4 or 5 words delivered flat and quiet, and Hatch's whole presentation rearranged itself. Hatch looked past Silas to the porch. He looked at Clara. She met his gaze and held it and did not move. He looked back at Silas, said one more thing, turned his horse and rode. Silas came back to the porch. He stood at the bottom step and looked up at her. "He knows about the affidavit," he said. His cousin reported back. "What did he say?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "He said he'd be willing to let the water rights question go, in the interest of neighborly relations." Clara looked at the road where Hatch had gone. "And the fence, the herd." He expressed regret about any incidents that may have caused concern. Silas said with a dryness so complete she almost missed it. "Regret," she said. That was the word. Clara pressed her lips together. "And you said—" "I said I appreciated him riding out." He paused. "And that if anything on my property was touched again, I'd be having that conversation with the county judge directly instead of the sheriff." He looked at her. "You gave me that idea. You said it better than I would have," she said. "I doubt that," he said. They looked at each other on the porch steps in the afternoon light, and it was a moment that didn't require decoration, didn't require anything added to it or taken from it. It was simply what it was, two people who had stood in the same direction against something and had not broken. "Clara," Silas said. She waited. He came up one step. He was still below her but closer, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that she had read as cold on the first day, and now knew were the opposite of cold, deep and careful and fully present in a way that most people's eyes never were. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "When you signed that affidavit last night—" He stopped, started again with the careful, deliberate honesty of a man who chooses his words the way he chooses everything else, precisely because they matter. "Did you sign it because of the legal situation, or because you wanted to—" The question sat between them in the afternoon air. Clara thought about the answer with the honesty it deserved. She thought about the stagecoach, and the dust, and the moment she'd looked at him, and felt her expectations collapse. She thought about the salt biscuits, and the fence wire, and Emma's hand in hers, and the particular way Silas had said her name the first time, Clara. Just 2 syllables. Nothing elaborate, and the way it had landed somewhere, it had no business landing this soon. "Both," she said. "At the start it was the legal situation. By the time I finished writing it—" She met his eyes. "It was entirely because I wanted to." Silas was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Jake, who had appeared in the doorway behind Clara, with the timing of a child who has decided that significant moments are exactly his business, made a small sound, and was immediately silenced by Emma appearing beside him and putting one small hand firmly over his mouth. Silas looked at his children, at the 2 of them in the doorway, Emma's hand over Jake's mouth, Jake's eyes wide and interested above it. Something happened in his face then that Clara had not seen before. Not the fractional, almost smile she'd catalogued and come to watch for, but something fuller. Something that broke through the careful management and was simply completely without reservation a real smile. Warm and sudden and entirely human. It changed his whole face. It made him look like the man he must have been before grief had laid its weather on him, and it made him look like the man he was becoming now, and Clara felt it in her chest, like the opening of a door. "Jake," Silas said. "Take your hand off your sister." "That's Emma's hand on my—" "Emma," Silas said. Emma removed her hand with great dignity. Jake rubbed his face. "We weren't listening," he said. "You were absolutely listening," Clara said. Jake decided this was not worth contesting. He looked at his father, then at Clara, then at his father again, with the clear-eyed assessment of a boy who has been reading rooms since before he knew that was what he was doing. "So it's settled?" he asked. "Everything. The important things," Silas said. "Are you going to—" Jake stopped, reconsidered. "I mean, are you—" He looked at Clara. "Are you staying for real, not just because of the paperwork?" Clara looked at Jake Drifter, at the adventurous wild streak boy with his father's jaw and his own bright restless eyes, who had asked her on the first day whether she knew how to do anything useful and had meant it entirely without cruelty. Who had showed her how to read his father's silences. Who had sat still at the kitchen table and let her clean a wound without asking to be comforted because he'd learned not to need it. And who deserved, she thought, to unlearn that? Yes, she said. For real. Not because of the paperwork. Jake nodded. Slow, deliberate. Filing it in the important place. Then, okay, he said, and disappeared back inside with the decisive finality of someone who has gotten the answer they needed and can now return to other concerns. Emma did not disappear. Emma stayed in the doorway and looked at Clara, and then at her father, and then at Clara again. And then she did something she had never done before. Not once in all the weeks since Clara had arrived, she crossed the porch and she put both arms around Clara's waist and she held on. Clara's hands came down around her immediately. She felt the small, fierce pressure of Emma's grip. Nothing tentative about it, nothing careful or measured, the way Emma was usually careful and measured, just a child holding on to someone she had decided was hers. Clara held on just as hard. Above Emma's head, she looked at Silas. He was looking at his daughter. At his daughter and the woman holding her, and the expression on his face was not something Clara could fully name too many things in it at once. Grief and relief, and something that was the beginning of a kind of hope that has been put away for a long time and is very carefully, very tentatively, beginning to come back out. He reached out and put his hand on Emma's back gently, the way he always touched his children, steady, present, saying without words the things he didn't put into language. And then he looked at Clara, and his hand was on Emma's back between them, and the distance that had been there on the stagecoach platform, all those miles of silence and wariness and careful management, was simply gone. "Thank you," he said, quietly, just to her. Not for the affidavit, not for the county clerk or the fence or the facing down of Gerald Hatch, for something larger than any of those things. Clara knew what he was thanking her for, and she received it the way it was offered, simply directly, without deflection. "You're welcome," she said. That evening, Clara wrote the letter to her sister. She wrote it at the kitchen table after supper, while Jake was doing his arithmetic, and Emma was braiding a strip of leather she'd found, and Silas was on the porch doing his last check of the property the way he did every night. Slow, deliberate, the sound of boots on boards, a man making sure everything was where it was supposed to be. She wrote, "I know you cried when I left. I know you told me I was making a terrible mistake. I want you to know that you were wrong, and I mean that as the kindest thing I've ever said to you." She wrote about the salt biscuits and the chickens, and Emma's hand on hers the first time they got an egg right. She wrote about Jake asking if she knew how to do anything useful, and about the fence wire, and about Silas teaching her the shelf system, and saying the word together at the kitchen table with the deed between them. She wrote about the affidavit and what it had felt like to sign it the second time, not as escape, but as arrival. She wrote, "He's nothing like I expected. He's better. Not in the ways I thought mattered, in the only ways that actually do." She did not write everything. Some things were not yet words. Some things were still in the process of becoming, still being built day by day, in the space between two people who had decided to stand in the same direction and mean it. But she wrote enough. She wrote, "I'm home, Alice. I didn't know I was looking for it. But I'm home." Outside, the boots stopped on the porch. The door opened. Silas came in, and the room shifted slightly in the way it always shifted when he entered it, not louder, not more crowded, just more present, more grounded, the way a foundation makes a house more solid by being there. He looked at the table, at the letter, at the children, at her. He went to the shelf and poured himself the last of the coffee. He sat in his chair, not across from her tonight, but beside her near enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he looked at what she was writing without reading it, because that was the kind of man he was. "Good letter?" he asked. "Honest one," she said. He nodded, drank his coffee. Jake looked up from his arithmetic and looked at the two of them sitting that close together, and looked back down at his arithmetic with the expression of someone who is very deliberately looking at his arithmetic. Emma set down her leather braiding and held up the finished piece and looked at it critically. Then she leaned over and tied it very carefully around Clara's wrist. She tied a knot that did not slip. She looked at her work. She gave one small, satisfied nod. Clara looked at the braid on her wrist. at Emma's small hands, at the knot that did not slip. Silas looked at it too, and when he looked back up at Clara, it was with that same open, unguarded expression she had seen break through on the porch. That rare, real, unmanaged look, and in his gray eyes was something steady and deep and permanent. The kind of thing that doesn't arrive with fanfare or grand gesture, but grows quietly in the space between 4:30 mornings and shared problems and the particular courage of two people deciding to trust the ground beneath their feet. Clara Ashford had stepped off a stagecoach in the dust and heat of Sagebrush Hollow, looking for something she couldn't name into a life she hadn't imagined with a man she didn't know, and two children who had every reason not to let her in. She had found none of what she'd expected. She had found everything that was real, and in this house, with this man and these children, and the sound of wind through cottonwoods, and the weight of a leather braid on her wrist tied in a knot that would not slip, she was not running from anything, and she was not settling for less, and she was not making do with what remained after better things had fallen through. She was exactly where she chose to be, and she intended to stay, and that in the end, in the only way that ever truly mattered, was more than enough. It was everything.
You did hijinks, it's you? Hell yes. All right, well, all the credit to you. That's amazing. Of course you would. I wouldn't think of anything different. By the way, hijinks, I'm on the very last. I'm not going to give any spoilers away for anyone who might be lurking at place 14. There's no spoilers I'm about to say. All I'm going to say is I'm on the very last quest in Dawn Trail. I'm on the very last quest, at least for the Dawn Trail expansion part. I haven't done anything post Dawn Trail yet. I'm about to do the last dungeon basically. But so yeah, so that's the thing. Hijinks, did I tell you that I did tell you. I think I did tell you last night. My PC, y'all, my PC last night decided to take the shitter. Yeah, it's been ever. Hello, Brian. Welcome in. Thank you for 10 stream streak. Hope you're doing well. Yeah, let me see. Okay, so we need to do this. Bring it to the back, which means make it left. So we're increasing 1 stitch per row on each side. Brian, how you doing? How's your evening? Hope you're doing well. But yeah, Danny, thank you for bringing a smile on my face and bringing your community over. I appreciate it. It's amazing when your community comes over. They're fantastic.